this meeting. I don't see anything on the website for the town.
TV. There's also a link on the town clerk's page for the YouTube. Just generated.
Community TV that we are on, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Urida?
Yes.
I've got a big gray screen covering everything in the middle now. And there's no X to make it go away. It says type search on the bottom.
We can see you.
I can see me in the little picture, but I can't see the background picture. I don't know what this thing is.
Would you like to exit the meeting and re-enter?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay.
All right. Actually, I think I better because I can't, I don't, it's covering up the buttons and things at the bottom. I don't know what I hit. So I'll be back soon. Shoot.
Okay, everyone. I'm going to call to order. Good evening. I am Kevin Hearn, Chair of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual public meeting on the 2021-2032 Program for Capital Improvements, or the CIP, as proposed by the Town Manager and the Superintendent of Schools. The CIP document is available on the town website. Because in-person attendance at public meetings is likely to increase the risk of transmission of COVID-19, this hearing is being conducted in accordance with Governor Lamont's Executive Order Number 7B. Will the town planner please call the roll?
Kevin Ahern,
Here.
Kevin Prestige,
Here.
Michelle Maresca,
Here.
John O'Donnell, he is not present for the record. Liz Gillette, Liz is here, she's just on mute.
Yeah, and I can't get out of this.
Alternate Gordon Binkhorst.
Here.
And alternate Andrea Gomes.
Here.
That is the roll, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Because of virtual format of this meeting, there are some special rules and procedures that I need to cover before I begin. This is a public meeting and not a public hearing. As such, public comment and testimony will not be received during these proceedings. The meeting is prescribed by the town charter and requires the Town Plan and Zoning Commission to review and make a recommendation to the council on the CIP. Commission members and town staff are participating by WebEx. Members of the public can view the meeting live on West Hartford Community Television Interactive Comcast Channel 5 and Frontier TV Channel 6098 or at www.whctv.org. whctv.org. The meeting is also being recorded for on-demand viewing, which will be available on the town website. Because of the virtual meeting format, there are some special rules and procedures that I need to cover before we begin. First, I ask that all participants please mute the microphones on your devices when you are not speaking. Second, pursuant to Executive Order 7B, all speakers must state their name and title each time they speak. Also, I will ask members of the commission to not address other participants directly. Comments and requests for information must be made through the chair. After you state your name, simply preface your question or comment with "through the chair." And when you are done, I will recognize the person who is most appropriate to respond. Although these practices may feel rigid and awkward, they will ensure the meeting is conducted in an orderly fashion and that members of the public who are listening can understand the discussion. Third, we will receive presentations tonight from the town manager, Matt Hart, and Tom Moore, superintendent of schools, supported by other staff as needed. For organizational purposes, I have asked them to divide their presentation in two parts. During the first part, I will ask the town manager to provide an overview of the town side of the CIP. When he is finished, I will call on members of the commission so that they can comment and ask questions. When I call on you, you may either provide comments or request information through the chair. I will then ask the town manager or his designated staff to provide relevant information if appropriate. During the second part of the presentation, the superintendent of schools will provide an overview of the school side of the CIP. We will repeat the same process for questions and answers. I will ask all members of the commission to please avoid requests for information that are repetitive, rhetorical, or argumentative. Requests for information and comments must be germane to the CIP and our role as the Town Plan and Zoning Commission in that review process. Finally, as a reminder that if any participant has a problem with their connection, you should immediately call Urida, whose phone number you were provided earlier. She will let me know and we will recess the meeting while the problem is resolved. If it cannot be resolved quickly, we will ask you to call into the meeting using a phone and participate via audio only. I would like to conclude by thanking everyone in advance for your patience. This is the first virtual public meeting of the Commission. There are bound to be some bumps and some glitches along the way, but we remain committed to the principle of open and transparent government. So with that, Mr. Hart, please proceed with your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Can you hear me okay? Good, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to address you tonight in a virtual mode. I want to commend our town and school district staff for doing what I believe is a truly extraordinary job supporting the community during the pandemic. We appreciate the support of boards and commissions like yourselves. And I hope that you and your families are personally doing well and that you are safe. Joining me tonight to assist with any questions you might have are Peter Privatera, our Director of Finance, Dwayne Martin, our Town Engineer, and Bob Palmer, our Director of Plant and Facilities, who supports both the town and the school district. I'll try to keep my presentation relatively short. I know most of you are veterans and are familiar with the capital improvement plan. We do prepare a 12-year plan, and it's a very important planning tool for the council and for the staff. We have a sizable inventory, as you know. I think about 2.2 million square feet of facilities, both town and schools included. We have hundreds of vehicles that we're also responsible for. We maintain our roads and take care of a whole host of other infrastructure as well, pursuant to this plan. I think it'd be helpful if you have the plan in front of you, if you could turn to page 3.1. I'll give you all a moment or so to do that. So again, we prepare a 12-year plan, which is longer than many local governments do, but it's worked well for the town of West Hartford for many years. But we pay particular attention to the first 2 years of the plan, as that's typically we allocate the funding for the first 2 years of the plan, and then we'll make revisions in the out years as needed. If you look at the top of page 3.1, and this is an overview of year one of the plan. This would be fiscal year 21. You can see the revenues to the top right of the page. Bonds, the vast majority of our project we finance through general obligation bonds. We issue approximately $14 to $16 million in bonded debt per year. West Hartford has a AAA bond rating, which is the highest rating that you can receive. And generally, the better the bond rating, the lower the interest rate you're paying on your debt. To the right of the bond category is CNRE. That stands for Capital Non-Recurring Expenditure Fund. And those are monies that we set aside for smaller capital projects. Typically, those monies may be monies that we've saved throughout the year, surplus funds, etc., that we are able to dedicate to this account. To the right of the CNRE category, you see the grants category. Those are typically federal and state grants that we might receive for important projects. You'll see, for example, when we get to the education component of the plan, a number of projects that are partially financed through state grants, and the same thing with respect to transportation and circulation. And then lastly, you have the other category. Those are typically projects that are funded by other town funds. A good example would be Westmore Park. You would see Westmore Park improvements towards the middle of the page. That is a separate fund, and we will try to finance projects related to Westmore Park from that fund. So those are the main revenues that we utilize to fund the capital improvement program. Again, with the bulk of the monies coming from general obligation bonds. With respect to expenditures, we break them down into the broad categories you see on the left-hand side of the page: transportation and circulation, education, which Superintendent Moore and his team will speak to later, Parks and Recreation, town building improvements, government operations, and then rolling stock and miscellaneous equipment. Let me just touch on a couple of examples under each category for the first year, and then I'll do the same thing for year 2. So, street construction of all types is typically funded under this category. The town's goal is to pave approximately 10 miles of road per year. We have fallen short of that in recent years due to cost increases and limited funding. So we did increase these line items a little bit this year in an effort to get closer to that 10-mile per year goal. And with the very competitive cost of gasoline right now, there's a chance we'll be able to achieve it. The North Main Street Road Diet, which you are probably all somewhat familiar with, also falls under this category, and that is in the planning and design stages now. Excuse me, the bid stage now. We've retained a consultant, and they will be beginning work if they haven't already near term. And then lastly, under this category, I wanted to highlight stormwater management. Stormwater management, I think, as you all know, has become an increasingly important issue for the town of West Hartford and a few other member towns of the MDC as well. We do have a significant study underway looking at our stormwater needs in the north central part of town, and expect that study is going to recommend a very significant investment on the part of the town, probably for many years to come. You probably all know this, but historically, homes in West Hartford were connected to the MDC's sanitary sewer service. That was considered best practice for decades, but that system can no longer handle both sanitary sewer as well as stormwater. So now, in partnership with the MDC, we need to work to separate our stormwater system from that sanitary sewer system. It will be a major effort over many, many years to come. The education category, Mr. Moore and his team will speak to. Under Parks and Recreation, for this first year of the plan, we are typically working on park and playfield improvements each and every year. For this coming year, we are looking to make an investment in the fields that we jointly use in collaboration with the school district at KP Middle School. And we are typically working on one of our outdoor pools each and every year as well. This coming year, we're looking to do some design work for both the Kennedy and Eisenhower bathhouses. Moving on to town building improvements. A couple of key things I would note, and I received some questions from you all on this last year. The first 3 items, the animal shelter, the police shooting range, and the recycling center modernization, all relate to a major project we have underway. It's in the design stage right now for our Brixton Street complex. We are looking to build out our waste management capacity so that we can build more of a true transfer station at that location, which we think would better serve the community. We also have a police shooting range, you may or may not know, below grade, below the Public Works building at Brixton Street. That is an important asset for us. It is dated. We do need to make some improvements to it. The same thing with our animal shelter, a very old facility, not at all meeting current code, and we're struggling to meet current needs there as well. That project is under design, and Mr. Palmer can assist with questions you might have under that category. Moving on to governmental operations. Revaluation, that's something we do every 5 years. As you probably know, our next revaluation is due for October 1st of 2021. We're actively working on that project now, and typically we retain some consulting assistance and software assistance related to that project. And then under rolling stock and miscellaneous equipment, this is where we fund the larger pieces of equipment that we buy in both public works and the fire department, as well as some of our smaller police vehicles. So for this coming year, we are looking to acquire some new public works vehicles. And then let's now turn to page 4.1, if you could. And I will spend even less time on this page since we already talked about the revenue, the major revenues we have. Under transportation and circulation, and again, it's all the same main categories. Many of these projects are a continuation. What would be new for year 2 would be a replacement of the Fern Street Bridge adjacent to Fern Ridge Park. You can see that we would be relying on a major grant to help fund that $4.2 million project. Under Parks and Recreation, in year 2 of the plan, we would be looking to make some significant improvements at the Sedgwick Middle School playing fields. And again, we share those in collaboration with the school district. So both the Parks and Rec units use those as well as the school itself. Under town building improvements, you can see a continuation of those Brixton Street projects. For the animal shelter, this would be the actual construction of a new shelter, the actual construction of the upgrades to the interior shooting range, as well as continued work under town building improvements. Those are the highlights I wanted to hit on the first 2 years of the plan. I know that was something of a quick overview, but I thought that would be most helpful to you. And if we could now pause and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I am scrolling through to see if we have any questions for the town manager. If you would raise your hand, and I will recognize you.
I believe Ms. Gillette has one, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Gillette. You are recognized. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, Mr. Hart, in terms of stormwater management and the work that we need to do with the stormwater drains with the MDC, do you have, is there any talk or anything in sort of the pipeline about improving stormwater management in perhaps less put it in a pipe and move it faster sorts of ways? I'm thinking of expanding wetlands or filtration or to increase the quality of our water.
Mr. Chairman, Matt Hart, Town Manager, in response to Commissioner Gillette. We are looking at that to some extent under the study that we have underway. I will ask Mr. Martin to elaborate. Impervious surface, as you all know very well, is a major contributor to our stormwater runoff, and that has increased over the decades. Many communities around the nation have been able to adopt various green approaches to help handle stormwater. In West Hartford, we are a little bit limited in the fact that our right-of-way, is typically a pretty narrow distance between the street and the sidewalk. But we are looking at those options. I also think that when it comes to new construction, it will be important for the town to continue to look at the applicants and how they can better control stormwater runoff. I know we've done some of that work, but in the future, do we want to require more pervious type surfaces, etc.? So let me pause there and ask Mr. Martin to elaborate on my comments in response to your question.
Chair recognizes Dwayne Martin.
Hi, Dwayne Martin, Town Engineer. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we see you and hear you.
Okay, thank you. Just to elaborate, yeah, we do have a drainage study, phase 1, that's underway, and we should be getting a draft of that study soon. The consultant is looking at our drainage system from a capacity standpoint as far as addressing some of the lingering street flooding issues that we have all over town, in the study area, that is. And then there's also secondary concerns with yard flooding and basement issues that are going to be discussed in the study as well. I think because of that and the fact that we don't have a drainage system throughout town, there's going to be a need to look at other options to address stormwater, especially during some of the moderate to heavy rain events. And certainly reducing impervious where we can is a huge part of that. As you guys know, anytime there's a redevelopment, there's a focus on trying to improve stormwater quality. The town also has an MS4 permit, which has aspects of stormwater quality with best management practices and goals that we're trying to achieve over the years of that permit. So that's it in summary.
Thank you. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. I have a hand up from Todd Dumais, the town planner. Go ahead, Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Todd Dumais, Town Planner. I'd just like to also note for the record that the Commission's recently adopted Plan of Conservation and Development within the Facilities and Infrastructure section discusses in its goals and strategies prioritizing the improvements to the town's stormwater infrastructure that reduce flooding and improve water quality. I think this is the result of Commissioner Gillette's question, but it specifically then says emphasis on sustainable green infrastructure improvements should be prioritized, and it discusses a framework for implementing low impact development guidelines, something that our town manager indicated we don't currently have in place, but you as the Planning Commission have identified that as a goal and an action over the next 10-year period. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. I just want to remind everyone to state their name and their position when they speak to another member on the WebEx to just speak through the chair. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I see no up. Commissioner Binkhorst, please. Mr. Binkhorst, you'll have to turn on your microphone.
Okay, it's on now. Commissioner Gordon Binkhorst, I had a question with regard to the POCD, and just to make sure that it was the upcoming version was incorporated into the CIP.
Mr. Chairman, Matt Hart, Town Manager. I can respond to that in part, and then would ask Mr. Dumais to supplement my comments. So the POCD was in its draft stage, Commissioner Binkhorst, when we were developing this plan, but it was something that we were cognizant of and looking towards. So I believe that what you have in front of you does comport to a large extent with the new POCD. Mr. Dumais was very careful to involve in a whole host of town staff as you worked on that plan over the last couple of years. And it's from our standpoint, we're excited about the new plan. We see it as an excellent planning tool and really represents best practices in many ways and will help shape the CIP. Throughout my career, I also see the POCD as an important touchstone, if you will, not just for the Planning Commission, but also for the Town Council and the town staff. And in reading the POCD, and you all know it very well, there's a mention of the need of various important town initiatives, whether it's looking at our various facilities, etc. It was important to all of us to incorporate those ideas into the plan so that when we're preparing the CIP, the town budget, looking at other major projects, we can point to the reference in the POC document itself. Turning back to you, Mr. Chairman, to ask Mr. Dumais to add to my comments.
Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Todd DeMay, Town Planner. Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Binkhorst. I think our town manager accurately characterized the CIP was developed in preparation with our development of the Plan of Conservation and Development. As a reminder, part of the commission's responsibility under this process, this referral process from the town council, specifically on the CIP, is to make a finding that the municipal improvements program contained within this document is consistent with your Plan of Conservation and Development. So, Commissioner Binkhorst, that's part of your charge here tonight, is to review our POCD up against the proposals in the document.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. Do we have any further questions for the town manager? Please raise your hand. Okay, I see no further questions from the commission for the town manager. At this point, then, we will move on to the school side. Tom Moore, Superintendent, please take it away.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Moore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Moore, Superintendent of Schools. The education budget, always facility needs divided into three components, typically recurring needs, program enhancement, and space needs. As most of you know, as detailed in our plan you have in front of you under Section 9, space needs are not a major issue over the coming years. We've had and I should say, remember this plan was put together before COVID-19. There are certain assumptions that we make that we're going to be reevaluating over the coming weeks and months, and we have been as we plan for whenever it is that we return to school. But in terms of this CIP over a 2-year period, mostly it reflects the same kind of building upkeep that we've put forward over the past few years. There's asbestos removal, there's money for sports and facilities, but the biggest area that you see here that's a shift in terms of program enhancements, and it's not a shift from the past couple of years, but it's a pretty dramatic departure from 10 years ago, is security enhancements. Most of the new projects we've been doing over the past couple of years have had to do with security. And specifically our entryways, we don't go into the great detail of exactly what every security enhancement is, because we don't want it out there necessarily as the public record as to where and what has changed. But there are key areas like the entryways of schools where we've made a commitment in a relatively short period with the benefit of getting much aid in grants from the state and the state security grants to change our entryways in our schools so that each school over time will eventually have a man trap as people enter the building, so it's not just a free entry to the building. So through the chairman, I was wondering if I could defer to Dr. Morrow to describe those changes that are coming in the next 2 years in the CIP. Dr. Andy Morrow is my assistant superintendent who oversees security enhancements and building.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. We will be handing it over to Andy Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Andy Morrow, Assistant Superintendent of Schools. As Tom mentioned, our security improvements are really a continuation of what we've been working on for a modification of our entrances. And for the upcoming year, we're looking at modifying at 5 of our elementary schools and really completing the entry systems regarding improved visibility of visitors, making sure that we're able to screen people and really improve the safety for our students and our staff. It also includes the replacement of select exterior doors at some schools and includes funding for a new mandate from the state that we provide a visual emergency management system in areas with high volumes of noise, such as cafeterias, auditoriums, and gymnasiums. This is something that the state has put in place and that we have to go ahead and integrate with our systems to become compliant.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Mr. Moore, hand it back to you.
In addition to that, really, Tom Moore, Superintendent, in addition to that, really, everything is basically the standard that we've put forward over the past few years. The long-range plan that's not in the next 2 years in terms of spending, we know that in the future at some point we're going to have to do something about windows and air quality in our buildings. So we put in long-range planning that we're not currently funding. But we still have buildings that the fresh air system of that building are the windows from the 1950s that are dependent on air coming in and air coming out of those windows. So there's certainly benefits from window replacement that hasn't happened in 70 years, in addition to new fresh air systems into those buildings that'll bring them into the modern era. But that's not in the next 2 years. That's far out in the out years. And of course, with the economic situation that we're in, we'll see how that comes about to be over time. So I'm happy to answer any specific questions about it or defer to Bob Palmer or Dr. Morrow with specific instances.
This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. Before I hand it off to the commission for questions, Tom Moore indicated that Bob Palmer, you may have anything to say. Otherwise, I'll hand it off for questions.
I'm all set, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Anyone else on staff before we hand it over to questions? Okay. All right. Do the commissioners have any questions for the superintendent or his staff? I do not see any raise. Oh, okay. Commissioner Maresca and then Commissioner Gillette.
Hi, Commissioner Maresca. I know the comments on the education component of the CIP mentioned that ventilation systems will be improved in various schools on a rolling basis. Does that incorporate upgrades to air conditioning for the schools as well? Is that a piece of those improvements? And then I have a second question. I don't know if you want me to wait on that, Mr. Chairman, or if you'd like me to ask them both at once.
Ms. Maresca, why don't you ask both questions and then Tom can handle those together.
Okay, great. And obviously this question comes up after the date that the CIP was published. The world has changed dramatically, especially for our school-age children. Everything has been remote for about 6 weeks now, 7 weeks now, I've lost track. And I realize this budget doesn't necessarily contemplate the challenges presented by that drastic change in how education is delivered. I wonder if there's going to be opportunity in the coming months to revisit some of these line items to better address some of the new needs that have arisen as we've moved to online learning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Tom Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Moore, Superintendent. I appreciate both those questions. In terms of, does it mean air conditioning? The answer is always most likely that it does, but it's not a definitive. If a place could do, and we don't know, we're talking about some buildings that would be 2030. You know, we'd have prioritized buildings earlier, but we don't know what those systems will be in place. We want the ability to be nimble to respond to it. If there are dehumidifying systems with clean air intake that would do that same work, that would be something. So we're not committing to it, but we're not saying it's not air conditioning. It's a fresh air project that if you're doing all of that work anyway, you would most likely do air conditioning at that time, but you could at least set it up so that air conditioning could be, but you'd have air intake. But the hope would be over time that it would be air conditioning throughout the district. But again, that will be a funding question in the out years. The computer question and capital non-recurring expenditures with computers is something that is a significant issue we're going to be dealing with. We have 2,000 computers and devices right now that are out with families and with kids that didn't have devices and wouldn't be able to access digital learning without that. In addition to that, we have mobile hotspots that we've gotten some funding, some volunteered funding, and otherwise that we're expending district funds for that. As we plan in the future, there is FEMA expenditures to replace things that are lost because of this specific crisis that we're going to look and see if that's a possible offset during this time, and we've put in for that. If that doesn't happen, no matter what, we know we're going to have to make more investments in computers, whether it's from the CIP budget, which CIP goes through the board and then it goes to the town council. So those expenditures, no matter what, I'm not going to have a choice as we go into the next year and in future years. We're going to have 2,000 computers that were out in people's homes that we're going to get back in various states that are, we have to realize we have to be one-on-one computing now, where there's a device for every student. We did that in the past without giving the device to every student, and we basically have had enough devices that kids could access them in schools, and they could sign out computers from the libraries to bring home, including devices with 4G, so that they could access the internet at home on a sign out. This is a whole different animal, because if we're in a system now where this is going to be extended, or there's going to be a mix, or it's going to be digital, we have to provide what children need to all students. So no matter what, we're going to need extra expenditures in technology in the coming years. That's just not a question. And we usually rotate these computers over a 5-year period, measuring use that happens during a school day, which is a couple periods a day. Now these computers being used all the time by these kids. They're good computers, they're Chromebooks, but the usage has been turned up a lot. So we're going to be needing to revitalize our equipment supply more frequently, is my educated guess, I'd say, on this.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. Before I turn to Ms. Gillette, I just wanted to see, Ms. Maresca, if you have any follow-ups for that question.
No, thank you. I appreciate the responses.
Thank you, Ms. Maresca. Okay, this is Kevin Ahern, chair again. So the next question will come from Commissioner Gillette.
This is Liz Gillette, and I have a very light question, which is, what is a visual alert system? Is this flashing lights in the cafeterias like you have with fire alarms, that kind of thing? Or how elaborate is a visual emergency alert? Thank you.
This is Kevin Ahern, chair again. Mr. Moore, go ahead.
Moore, Superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a light system, and it's not just in the cafeteria. It's in our hallways, it's in our locker rooms, and it's actually on the outside of our building. West Hartford has the largest population. West Hartford Public Schools has the largest population of students who are either other hearing impaired or deaf. And so this is a need that we would have put in place and we've been planning for anyway, but now it comes as a system that we don't have a choice with anyway. We've had some levels of it at the buildings where we've had a higher population. This mandate's hit throughout the district. So it's, well, it seems like just a light should be not that expensive. It seems these projects to tie into our alarms are actually pretty expensive.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. This is Kevin Ahern again, the chair. Before we turn to any other questions, I just wanted to see if Commissioner Gillette had any follow-up to that. And Ms. Gillette is indicating that she does not. And so I will turn to the commission again. Are there any further questions for Mr. Moore? I see no hands up. Okay. So we have come to the end of the presentation unless Mr. Moore or Mr. Hart have anything further. I see they do not indicate that they have anything further. So at this point, then we're going to I will entertain a motion on this. So for the CIP, I'm sorry, Mr. Dumais, point of order. Chair recognizes Todd Dumais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Todd Dumais, Town Planner. Before you recognize the commission, just for voting purposes, I'd like to note for the record, Commissioner Gomes will be seated on this application for Commissioner O'Donnell for voting purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, Chair. So seated on this vote will be Ms. Gomes. Okay, so I want to note for everyone that because of the nature of this meeting, that all votes in this meeting and in the subsequent meeting will be taken by roll. That is, that Mr. Dumais will poll each of you, and you will state your vote as he polls you. Okay? And so at this point, we will start, however, with a motion on this. The motion would be to recommend approval to the Town Council. Okay, Mr. Prestige, the chair recognizes Kevin Prestige.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige, I'd like to move to recommend approval of the CIP.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is the chair, Kevin Ahern. I would also like to note as a point of order that currently the town is operating so that we do not need a second. So the motion itself is sufficient. And with that, is there any discussion? If you have anything to say, raise your hand at this point before we take the vote. Okay. Seeing no discussion, at this point then, Mr. Dumais. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Gillette. Ms. Gillette, I see a hand. No?
I just wanted to say that I understand as a preliminary and the POCD was just in the offing, et cetera. I would like to say that I think we need to work closely with the town and with the applicable committees, council committees, about outside of the drain pipe stormwater management infrastructure improvements that we want to go forward with, and how to find funding and grants and things like that. Like, I think in the future we ought to initiate more emphasis on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gillette. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I'm just noticing for my own purposes, when you raise your hand, just keep it up. I'll eventually find you. There's a lot of squares that I'm looking at here, but I will eventually track you down so that you can speak. So again, I will ask the commission, does anyone have anything further? Ms. Maresca.
Commissioner Michelle Maresca. I just wanted to say, well, a couple things. One is I take great pride in how well run the town of West Hartford is. So I thank you all for that. And I always look forward to looking at our CIP. And once again, I think you've done a great job. I also echo Commissioner Gillette's comments in that I do believe that this current CIP does reflect many of the goals and policies we just put forth in our recently adopted POCD. But I look forward to working together with you in coming years in furthering some of the more aggressive or progressive policies, if you will, in the POCD, especially with respect to focusing infrastructure improvements in a way that helps us realize the overall plan vision. As I began, I think this CIP for the current fiscal year or upcoming fiscal year does a good job at bringing us a step closer to doing that. And I do appreciate the earlier responses to my questions that showed that the town has already been thinking about some of the large changes that have happened since the time this was put together, and has plans in motion, or maybe in motion is just not quite right, but they have plans or thoughts about how to revisit and supplement what's in the CIP as needed. So thanks very much for that. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Maresca. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Anyone else has anything further, just raise your hand. I am scrolling. Okay, I see no further comments. I would personally like to comment while I've got most of the town staff here on this call. I cannot commend you enough for the work that you've been doing, not only on this CIP, and I know I spoke to us only asking things and making comments about what is germane. However, you all have been doing an amazing job under exceptionally trying circumstances. I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate the work product that you've been pushing out in general, but also during this time. And so with that, I am going to poll the commission, or I'm going to ask, Mr. Dumais to poll the commission and call the roll.
Commissioner Gomes,
In favor.
Commissioner Gillette,
Yes.
Commissioner Maresca,
Aye.
Commissioner Prestige,
Aye.
and Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Aye. The chair recognizes the vote is 5-0. Recommendation to the town council. Thank you, everyone. So at this point in the meeting, I would like to ask that all of the commissioners please remain on this WebEx, as we will be transitioning into another meeting shortly. However, at this point, we will be recessing, and I want to thank everyone for their work on this. Oh, sorry, Mr. Dumais, point of order.
Point of order, just for the record, this CIP meeting is closed. We're recessing this virtual meeting until we begin our regular meeting at 7 p.m.
All right, then, Mr. Dumais, I have a question, point of order then. Does the commission need to take an adjournment?
Yes.
Okay, then entertain a motion to adjourn. I am seeing, okay, Mr. Prestige, please.
So moved.
Thank you. And so we have our motion. Then let me try your minds. All those in favor of adjournment, Mr. Dumais, please take the roll.
Commissioner Gomes,
Aye.
Commissioner Gillette,
Aye.
Commissioner Maresca,
Aye.
Commissioner Prestige,
Aye.
Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Aye.
With that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. The meeting is adjourned.
Can I ask a question?
Hey everybody, this is Kevin. I'm just checking to see we've got all our commissioners. Oh, actually, wait, you're right, it's not there, so we gotta wait. Okay,
Sorry, yes, I'm on.
and I just have to fix something with my. Oh. Okay, do we have all our commissioners? I believe we have all of our commissioners.
Todd,
Okay, everybody. Do we
everyone
have any
here?
questions?
We're all set. I told. She's back on.
Okay. Good evening. I am Kevin Ahern, Chair of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual meeting and public hearing of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission. The required meeting agenda, application materials, and legal notice are all available on the town website. Because in-person attendance at public meetings is likely to increase the risk of transmission of COVID-19, this hearing is being conducted in accordance with Governor Lamont's Executive Order 7B and 7I. Will the town planner please call the roll?
Kevin Ahern,
Here.
Kevin Prestige,
Here.
Michelle Maresca,
Here.
John O'Donnell. For the record, he is not here. Liz Gillette,
Here.
Gordon Binkhurst, for the record, Gordon's microphone is muted, but he is here.
I am here.
Andrea Gomes,
Here.
Dumay, Town Planner, is present, and Gina Verano, Assistant Corporation Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Dumay. This is Kevin Ahern again. For the record, I would like to note that we have a full quorum of the commission. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, there are some special rules and procedures that I need to cover before I begin. Commission members and town staff are participating by WebEx. Members of the public can view the meeting live on West Hartford Community Television or on West Hartford Community Interactive Comcast Channel 5 and Frontier TV Channel 6098 or at www.whctv.org. Again, that's www.whctv.org. The meeting is also being recorded for on-demand viewing which will be available on the town website. Because of the virtual meeting format, we're going to cover some special rules and procedures before we begin. First, I ask that all participants please mute your microphones on your devices when you are not speaking. Second, pursuant to Executive Order 7B, all speakers must state their name and title each time they speak. Also, I will ask members of the Commission and the applicant to not address the other participants directly. Comments and requests for information must be made through the chair. After you state your name, simply preface your question or comment with "through the chair," and when you're done, I will recognize the person who is most appropriate to respond. Although these practices may feel rigid and awkward, they will ensure the meeting is conducted in an orderly fashion and that members of the public who are listening can understand the discussion. The first part of this meeting is a public meeting of the Commission and not a public hearing. As such, comment and testimony will not be received during these proceedings. The public hearing will convene at 7:15, or in this case, afterwards. And at that time, I will provide additional instructions for special rules, conduct, and public access to the hearing. So with that, Mr. Dumais, please proceed with the first item on our agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Todd Dumais, Town Planner. The first item on our agenda are the approval of the March 2nd meeting minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. We have before us the meeting minutes from the March meeting. I will entertain a motion to approve on that. Please raise your hand if you wish to make that motion. I see Mr. Prestige. The chair recognizes Kevin Prestige.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige, I'll move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I just want to note that we are only required to have a motion. We do not need a second at this point. So any discussion on this item, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, let me try your minds. Mr. Dumais, point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Todd Dumais, Town Planner. Point of order, Commissioners Maresca and Gomes were absent from the March 2nd meeting. So we traditionally proceed with just the 4 present members voting. In this instance, it would be Commissioners Ahern, Prestige, Gillette, and Binkhorst.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais, and I will rely on you throughout the night to make sure to let me know who's voting. So again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. And so at this point, without any further discussion, Mr. Dumais is going to take the roll on this vote.
Commissioner Binkhorst.
Commissioner Binkhorst says aye.
Commissioner Gillette.
Aye.
Commissioner Prestige.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Aye.
With that, the meeting minutes pass unanimously 4-0.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. At this point, then, we will move on to item number 2, communications. Are there any communications, Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dumais for the Town Planner. We have 2 communication items. One was emailed to you on Friday with your agenda information. That was a letter from the applicant for the item on our agenda, the new business item number 3, application 1124. It was a communication from Brian Blazier, attorney for Dinsmore and Scholl, representing Carvana, stating that that application was being withdrawn. So the communication you received last week withdrew our new business item number 3. No action is required for that communication by the commission. But just as a point of order, that new business item is no longer on our agenda. Secondly, we do have a public comment communication that we will address during the public hearing portion of this evening's hearing for the Beachland Park wetland application. I will discuss that and read that communication into the record when we get there. but I just want to make a note of order that was emailed out to the commission prior to this hearing, and it's posted on the town's website.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Do the commissioners have any questions for Mr. Dumais at this point? Please indicate so by raising your hand. Okay, seeing none. Moving on then to new business item number 3, Mr. Dumais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated in my previous discussion on a communication item, this item is officially withdrawn by the applicant since you have not yet received it or made a determination of significance. Their letter is sufficient for that withdrawal. No action is required by the agency.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. With that, then, we will move on to the public hearing portion of the evening, at which point I will need to say some more things. All right, so once again, I'm Kevin Ahern. I'm chair of the Town Planning and Zoning Commission. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's public hearing of the Town Planning and Zoning Commission on application 1120, which is 847 South Quaker Lane, Beachland Park. For the record, I would like to note that the required meeting agenda, application materials, and legal notice are all available on the town website. Because in-person attendance at public meetings is likely to increase the risk of transmission of COVID-19, this hearing is being conducted in accordance with Governor Lamont's Executive Order 7B and 7I. With that, will the town planner please read the legal notice?
West Hartford Plan and Zoning Commission legal notice. The Town of West Hartford Planning and Zoning Commission, also acting as the Inland, Wetland and Watercourse Agency, will hold a regular meeting at 7 p.m. on Monday, May 4th at 2020. Public hearings will convene at 7:15 p.m. or soon thereafter as the matter may be heard on the following. 847 South Quaker Lane, Beachland Park, application Inland Wetland 1120 of the Town of West Hartford, requesting approval of an inland wetland and watercourse permit to conduct certain regulated activities which may have an adverse impact on a wetland and watercourse area. The applicant is proposing to remove accumulated sediment from a silt pond and restore a drainage ditch located within Beachland Park. The proposed activity takes place within a wetlands, a watercourse, and adjacent 150-foot upland review area. Submitted for agency receipt on March 2nd, 2020. Determined to be potentially significant and set for public hearing on April 6th. Meeting postponed and rescheduled to May 4th. At this hearing, interested persons may be heard or written communication received as outlined below. The applications related to the item above are available for public review in the Town Planning and Zoning Commission website at www.westhartfordct.gov/TPZ. Click on Current Agenda. Virtual meeting viewing instructions. The public hearings will be conducted exclusively as virtual meetings in accordance with the Town Planning and Zoning Commission rules and regulations for the transaction of business and Executive Orders 7B and 7I issued by Governor Ned Lamont. The public hearings will be broadcast live on television on the West Hartford Community Interactive Comcast Channel 5 and Frontier TV Channel 1698 and streamed live at www.whctv.org. Audio comment. Any interested persons may participate in real time by calling 1-415-655-0001 and using the following access code 225-961-519 at 7:15 p.m. Participants using caller ID blocking will not be permitted to participate. Participants will be called in the order in which their call was received. When prompted by the chair and/or moderator, participants will have the permission to speak on matters germane to the hearing. Written comment. Any interested persons may submit written comment via email to comment.tpz@westhartfordct.gov. Written comments will be made part of the record on the May 4th, 2020 public hearing and posted on the town's website. In order to be included as part of the record, comments must have meet the following requirements. They must be received no later than 3:30 p.m. on Monday, May 4th. The subject of the email shall be the application number and address addressed to TPZ May 4th public hearing. The body of the email must begin with interested persons' full name and street address, and comments must be germane to the application in no longer than 500 words. This notice was posted on the town website on 4/23. Kevin Ahern, TPC Inland Wetland Chairman, Todd DeMay, Town Planner, Inland Wetland Administrative Officer. Any individual with a disability who needs special assistance to participate in a meeting or public hearing should contact Susan Oslander at Department of Social Services 7 days prior to the meeting or hearing date. Mr. Chairman, that is the notice. I'd also like to point out that in compliance with Governor Lamont's executive orders 7IE, a posting of sign was completed and posted on the Beachland Park property for 7 continuous days prior to this hearing. And in compliance with Executive Order 7IF, all direct property owners were mailed an abutting property owner notice of this hearing with rules for meeting access and viewing that were just read into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeMay. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. For the record, I would like to note that we have a full quorum of the commission. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, there are going to be some special rules and procedures that I need to cover before I begin, some of which will overlap with much what Mr. DeMay just told you. So, commission members, town staff, and the applicant are participating by WebEx. Members of the public can view the meeting live on West Hartford Community Television or West Hartford Community Interactive, Comcast Channel 5, and Frontier TV Channel 6098, or at www.whctv.org. Again, that's www.whctv.org. The meeting is also being recorded for on-demand viewing, which will also be available on the town website. Because of the virtual meeting format, there are going to be some special rules and procedures that I need to cover before we begin. First, phone access is only intended for those members of the public who wish to actively participate and provide comments on the noticed application for 847 South Quaker Lane, Beachland Park, Inland Wetland 1120. If you are interested in speaking on this item, please call 1-414-655-0001. Again, that number is 1-414-655-0001. And enter the access code 225-961-519. Again, that's 225-961-519. If you're on the phone and do not plan to speak, please hang up and watch live on television on West Hartford Community Interactive Comcast Channel 5, Frontier TV Channel 6098, or streaming at whctv.org. Again, if you do not plan to comment, please hang up your phone now and instead listen to the hearing on the television or on the internet. Thank you. So, for the members of the public who are still on the phone, please do not mute your device. The meeting moderator will keep everyone's line muted until it is your turn to speak. If you mute your own line, the moderator may not hear your voice when she calls for comment. Second, I would like to describe how the hand-raising process will work. Unfortunately, our conference technology does not allow us to identify individual callers by name. So when the public comment portion of the meeting begins, the moderator will randomly unmute one call-in line and ask everyone to say their name at the same time. The voice that we hear will belong to the person whose line is unmuted. That person will then be recognized by the moderator and asked to restate their name and provide their street address. We will repeat this process until we have unmuted every phone line. It is very important that you say your name each time you are prompted by the moderator. If the moderator unmutes a phone line and does not hear a voice after the prompt, that phone line will be removed from the conference. If you have called in and are also streaming the meeting on YouTube or watching on TV, please silence your other device when you speak. Otherwise, there will be an echo because there is a slight delay in the television and streaming broadcast. Third, I ask that all speakers keep their comments brief and germane to the application. Obscene, offensive, or threatening language will not be tolerated. Anyone who violates this rule will receive a warning. And if the conduct continues, I will ask the moderator to mute that person's phone line for the remainder of the meeting. If the violation is egregious, that person will be muted immediately. Fourth, for the public was provided an opportunity to submit written comments on the application via mail and email. These comments have been published on the town's website as a PDF and are embedded in the online agenda. For the record, I will read the names. Sorry, Mr. Dumais, point of order.
I can read the one comment into the record, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to interject, there are no other comments that have been received. Since the deadline of 3:30 p.m., no other comments have been received, nor have any mail comments in the mail were received in our office. The one comment received, since there is only one, I'd like to read it into the record with your permission, Mr. Chairman.
This is Kevin Ahern, the chairman again. Yes, please, Mr. Dumais, proceed.
From Elora Santarocco. I live in Quaker Green, adjacent to the park, an area in which we have experienced significant drainage issues. So I support this application as it seems that it could improve our drainage, some of which drains into the park's system. I do have a concern about what I believe is the need to drain, quote, de-water, LOL, the pond in order to dredge it. And that is what will happen to the water runoff during that period, and how long is it expected to last? I hope that this will be addressed at the meeting on Monday evening, and I plan to attend. Thank you in advance. Laura Santarocco. For the record, that communication was also shared with the applicant, and I asked that they address Ms. Santarocco's comments during their presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. So I'd like to just finally say that the members of the public are welcome to continue sending comments to, there's an email address, which is comment, COMMENT, .tpz, that's Town Planning and Zoning, comment.tpz at westhartfordct.gov. That's westhartfordct.gov. And those comments will be distributed to the members of the commission and also read into the record. Okay, so finally, I would just like to outline to the attendees the so-called rules of engagement and how the commission operates in a public hearing. So those presenting or commenting should state their name and address for the record. Please spell your name. The commissioners may ask questions during the testimony of the applicant. All the questions and the comments will be directed through the chair and only after recognition by the chair, including the follow-ups. If feasible, the chair will have the members hold their questions until the end of the applicant's presentation or the end of a logical break in the applicant's presentation. Following the testimony of the applicant, the public will then have a chance to comment about the current application. Upon conclusion of the public's comments, the applicant will have the opportunity to address the opinions expressed. And then upon conclusion of the applicant's rebuttal, and if there's no further questions from the commissioners, the public hearing will be closed. It is the practice of the commission to render a decision on an application on the same night, following all of the items on the public meeting agenda. So I would like to thank everyone in advance for your patience. This is our first virtual public hearing. We are still learning from the experience, so there will be bound to be bumps and glitches along the way, but we remain committed to the principles of open and transparent government. So, with that, will the applicant please proceed with their presentation?
Good evening. For the record, Helen Rubino-Turco, Director of Leisure Services and Social Services for the town of West Hartford. And through the chair, Mr. Ahern, I just wanted to give you a brief summary of what we're planning to do, kind of a who, what, where, when, why, how sort of presentation. And then I'm going to introduce two other speakers, Megan Raymond, a soil scientist from Milone and McBroom, as well as Julie Vieira, who is an engineer in our engineering department. Also on the phone is Justin Andrews from the Department of Public Works, and he is also available for questions. So we do have a PowerPoint, and if the host would post that, we can go through it. So just a little bit of the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Leisure Services and the Department of Public Works, along with engineering, are sponsoring this application. Leisure Services noticed some flooding in Beachland Park and near the baseball field. And as you might remember, Beachland Park sits at the bottom of South Quaker Lane. It has functioned as a park since probably the 1920s. And in the early 1930s, the creamery building was repurposed from a creamery into a park clubhouse. Between that clubhouse, just to the west of the clubhouse, is a large pond. And just that was a man-made pond, probably made in the 1930s, we think. We did some research, and there are articles in the Hartford Current dating back to the early 1930s that reference the large pond. And just to the west of that pond is the little silt pond and a drainage ditch. And that is what we are going to be talking about tonight. So we noticed some flooding along the right field, the first base right field line between where the baseball field is and the hill that forms the border with what is now called Quaker Green to the south. And so we sent DPW over to take a look, and they couldn't find a catch basin. And then we sent surveyors over, and they discovered a clogged catch basin. And so then we got engineering involved, and they did a further investigation, and they discovered some plans and some that revealed that a pipe runs from the south side of the baseball field through the outfield to the silt pond. And they surmised that this pipe was probably clogged with debris. Numerous areas drain into this pond, as you will hear from engineering. Some of them come from the Quaker Green side, some come from the New Britain Avenue side to the west, and some come from the Mayflower area. And so multiple things feed into this catch basin and the drainage ditch that's next to it. Eventually these waters, some of them go into the pond, some of them continue north, and then they to a pipe that travels along the driveway, along the access road in the park, so kind of east-west. It travels east and eventually into the branch of the Trout Brook. So what you're going to hear from us this evening is Megan Raymond from Mylona McBroom is going to discuss what the existing conditions are like. She's going to give you her soil report with all of the various details. And then Julie Vieira is going to take over, and she'll describe the objectives, why we're doing this, why we need to do this, and how we plan to do it. And then, of course, we will wrap up with how we're going to keep this going afterwards. This silt pond was created. It was probably meant to be fixed or amended or emptied, or certainly had some maintenance, but that really hasn't happened. And so we find ourselves in this situation. So we intend to clean it regularly afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to, through the chair, I would like to end my comments and introduce Megan Raymond. Thank you, Mr. Ahern.
Thank you, Helen. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I would like to recognize Megan Raymond. Ms. Raymond, if you could just unmute your microphone, please.
I apologize.
Go to the next slide.
I thought the host was on that, so I'll be on top of it next time. Apologies. Good evening. For the record, my name is Megan Raymond. I'm a senior project manager, professional wetland scientist, and registered soil scientist with Mylona McBroom. And we were retained by the town to delineate the wetlands within the subject area of Beachland Park, and as well as identify potential feasible and prudent alternatives to the objective of the project, which is to maintain the existing stormwater features. Excuse me. As Helen mentioned, the work areas that we're looking at this evening are comprised of a 4,000 square foot silt pond that's located. Do I have control of the screen? Can I use my arrow? I guess I'm not sure. That's located in the southern portion of the project area, and a 150-foot long drainage ditch that flows to the northeast, just north of the silt pond. As you can see in this drawing here, and this is just a drawing of our wetland delineation, demonstrating the wetland delineation points and the resources identified. We have the large pond that Helen introduced that sits east of the subject area, and that is not a subject of discussion or interest this evening. All of our work area is located west of this. So within these areas that the engineering department did identify some original design drawings. These features were constructed in the early 80s, 1981, and they were created to address stormwater management. As you can see, this network of pipes that feed into these areas, the primary pipe that feeds the silt pond consists of a 48-inch pipe, and what primarily feeds in terms of surface water this subject pond is the first flush. There's a control weir that Julie can get into a bit, the town engineer, the engineering department can get into a little bit later, but essentially this pipe is fed by the first flush of stormwater, and it's meant to capture stormwater, renovate, allow some residence time, renovate that stormwater, and then discharge to the pond to the east, the larger pond that eventually goes on to Trout Brook. Trout Brook in this location is about a 3.5 square mile watershed, eventually obviously draining to the Connecticut. So when we went out to flag the wetlands, we identified this 4,000 square foot silt pond largely within a manicured lawn setting with some impervious areas with the parking lot located to the north and east. When the original design drawings were envisioned, there was a lip of riprap around the perimeter of this pond that's not in evidence today. Rather, the pond is vegetated within the northern portion of the pond where the primary outlet exists. We have a small alluvial fan there with a lot of accumulated sand. So that area is not ponded at all presently, but rather subaerial and a surface feature that has some rooted saplings, a couple red maple saplings, and a pussy willow. And then there's a cattail growth, and then there's only about a quarter of the pond that's even open water. In probing the area with a sediment rod, we observed between 18 inches and 5 feet of accumulated silt and very little standing water in the pond. So what's happened is that the ability of this area to renovate and retain stormwater flows has been compromised by the lack of storage capacity within the feature. We're not seeing an abundance of storage. So what happens is that this will easily spill over in large rain events and potentially affect water quality in the watershed, localized water quality in the watershed. Similarly, what we see in this drainage ditch, which is a very narrow feature, again, within a manicured lawn landscape with some scattered canopy trees right off of this parking lot. This area, I guess technically it's truly a ditch. From a regulatory perspective, you'd call it I suppose an intermittent stream, but that might even be generous. It's driven primarily by stormwater. There's not a lot of base flow that contributes to this. Original design drawings identified riprap in the base of this. That's not evident today, but there is some eroded bituminous asphalt in some patches. It doesn't have a lot of channelized flow, and it is in need of some maintenance. So after looking at these features and delineating the resources, we were speaking with the engineering department, and instead of what we were looking at in terms of feasible and prudent alternatives, kind of steered us towards the ability in this particular maintenance project, which is a definite need. There's a definite need for maintaining these types of stormwater treatment systems because the maintenance, the creation of these systems and the absolute maintenance of them will serve the purpose to address localized flood flows as well as water quality in our watershed here, which are important features to look at in protecting our natural wetland environments. These constructed wetland environments are perfect in terms of contributing appropriate wetland functions as it relates to sediment intoxicant retention and retention of flood flow. But because they were constructed, they do need some degree of maintenance because they're not self-supporting systems. So we as designers need to periodically maintain these constructed features. But in speaking to the engineering department, and looking at these design drawings from the 80s, which obviously we've come a long way in terms of looking at design of some features since the 80s, it looked like a great opportunity to, instead of riprap around the edge of the pond, we could introduce some small emergent shelves of native vegetation, some woolgrass and some iris, add some visual and color interest along the edge of the pond. So it's not going to be just a sharp feature with riprap, but rather a softer shelf edge with some native emergent plantings that's going to help with some bioassimilation and some small contributions to wildlife. But obviously we're looking at a very small area, so I don't want to oversell that component. It's primarily for bioassimilation in this regard, in this aspect. As it relates to the use of vegetation in the ditch, that's a little bit trickier given the narrow confines and the tight borders to our developed interfaces on both sides. More than likely that will be stabilized with stone, but if there is an opportunity to plant some additional native plugs along the eastern edge, that may be possible. But it's not as easy an application in that particular instance. Julie is going to describe, our town engineer, Julie Vieira, the engineering department, Julie Vieira is going to describe the actual mechanism of the maintenance. But in summary, the proposed project is not going to adversely affect the wetland function in these areas. In fact, these are created features that are required, and some maintenance is required to maintain them in order to protect the water quality and flood flow, prevention of flood flow damage to natural wetland systems in the larger watershed. So in fact, we're not looking at an impairment, but rather an important routine maintenance project in this regard. I'm happy to conclude my overview and turn it to Ms. Vieira to describe the mechanisms of the proposed project. Thank you so much. I'm also happy to answer any questions if you'd like through the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Raymond. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Again, I think what we'll do, since it's a part of the natural flow, we will hand it off and hold questions on this until the end. So, Ms. Vieira, please.
Great.
Take it away.
Good evening. Julie Vieira, Town of West Hartford, Engineering Department. So our main objective of the project was to improve the function of how the stormwater flows through the silt pond and the drainage ditch. There's a large 48-inch pipe that carries water from the Quaker Green complex as well as New Britain Avenue and part of the Mayflower Street area. There is a structure before the 48-inch outlets into the drainage ditch, and inside, as Megan had mentioned, there's a weir in there which kicks the first flush over to the sediment pond in, I think, a 12-inch pipe. But currently the silt pond doesn't clean the water going into it, and the drainage ditch is carrying eroded sediment downstream to Trout Brook. So the primary goal is to establish the silt pond and the drainage ditch to their intended purposes, which is all based on the early plans from the 1980s. As Helen had mentioned, neither one appears to have been maintained, so the first step would be to clean out the sediment. For the silt pond, that would mean installing the usual sedimentation and erosion controls, blocking the inlets to the pond. Aside from the first flush pipe that comes in there, there's also a catch basin from roughly the south side of that baseball field that also discharges into the pipe. And then there's a pipe that goes out of the silt pond to the main pond. that we, before we could remove sediment, all 3 of those pipes would have to be plugged. We would pump any remaining water that was in the silt pond via a pump and a hose and a filter sock to the drainage ditch. We don't anticipate that there would be a lot of water in the pond, but there is some residual water in the pond now because it gets trapped because it's not completely open. It's got the little island in the middle. And then we would move forward to excavating the material. In excavating the material, this would include the removal of 9 trees, which would be replaced in kind elsewhere within the park. The excavated material would be stockpiled as shown on the plans, which is sort of between the north of the silt pond and south of the drainage ditch, which would be run with sedimentation erosion control measures. The plan is to let the material dry out, and then the material will be hauled off the site. The pond was designed so that the sediment enters the pond, settles to the bottom, and it would allow the water to flow over it. But currently it's not functioning because it's pretty much filled up. We are proposing to reestablish the bottom, which is 5 feet below the existing inverts on the pipe. And the slopes are proposed to be 1.5 to 1 and would be stabilized with riprap. The bottom would remain in its natural state. There are 2 areas along the upper banks of the pond. It's probably 670 square feet on the north side and sort of on the southwest side where we could plant native emergent plants, as Megan had mentioned. The plants are going to provide a water quality benefit to the pond, not only the silt pond, but also to the main pond to clean the water that goes in there. Currently, you could see from the silt pond to the main pond, at that outlet into the main pond, there is some sediment buildup there and also some invasive species that are starting to grow there. For the drainage ditch, the plan here is also to restore it to an original, as close to original as we could get it. From the 1980 plan, it looks like it's a 6-foot wide bottom. It looks like it was asphalt. And pretty much 2 to 1 side slopes. In your set of plans, there was profiles that were given, and as you could see, there is not a straight connection from the outlet of the 48-inch pipe to the head wall of the 24-inch pipe. It sort of goes up and down. The plan is to straighten this line out so it's a positive slope from the 48-inch pipe to the 24-inch pipe. There also is some eroding from the side slopes that are falling in. There's probably a lot of velocity with that 48-inch pipe when it's running full, and so some of the slopes have sloughed off and fell into the drainage ditch, as well as the outlet of the 48-inch pipe has wing walls on it, and it also has a concrete apron that ends at the wing walls. And currently, the bottom right adjacent to the concrete apron is getting scoured out, and this scoured out area is starting to encroach along the backside of the wing walls and will eventually impact the stability of those wing walls. So for this project, it's proposed to put back a positive slope on the bottom of the drainage ditch from the 48-inch to the 24-inch. This will be done by excavating the material, and there is a natural meander in the drainage ditch at this time, and we are going to keep that natural meander. At the end of the wing walls, I proposed a preformed plunge pool to help dissipate those velocities when the water is coming out of there, to help prevent further erosion, not only to the bottom of the drainage ditch, but also the erosion of the slopes around the wing walls. The side slopes of the drainage ditch are going to be stabilized with riprap. And there also is, towards the north end of the drainage ditch, right before the head wall, there's a paved leak off from the parking lot that is also proposed to be replaced in kind. On the north side of the driveway, there's a catch basin that has accumulated sediment around it from overtopping of the driveway and or surcharging of the catch basin. And so it has built up. It's probably 6 to 8 inches. All you could see is the top of the frame of the catch basin. So as part of this project, the plan is to grade back, remove some of that built up sediment and grade back the land a little bit, maybe 10 feet around it to get it to function properly. The plan is for the town Department of Public Works to complete the work. They will be using best management practices, performing the work, which includes sedimentation erosion controls, to limit the work area to one work area at a time. The plan is to perform the work either during the dry season or frozen. The stockpiled material, as I said, is going to be wrung with sedimentation erosion controls and allowed to dry out and then hauled off-site. And then all sedimentation erosion controls will remain in place until stabilized. So, in moving forward, the plan is to keep the silt pond and the drainage ditch functioning as intended. So we anticipate inspecting annually both the drainage ditch and the silt pond to determine how fast the sedimentation is accumulating. And then from there, we can determine how often we need to clean it out. And at this point, I think this is all I had. I'll turn it back to Helen.
Thank you, Ms. Vieira. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I recognize Helen.
Thank you, Mr. Ahern. Helen Rubino-Turco, Director of Leisure Services and Social Services for the Town of West Hartford. We have on the telephone Justin Andrews from Department of Public Works. So if anyone has any questions on what machines or how he's going to do this work, he can answer those questions at the end. For all of the trees that we remove, we do intend to plant the same number of trees, but they probably would be located on the southwest side of the larger Beachland Pond, sort of around the pond, a combination of trees that we know work well in wetlands, like the witch hazel and the red osier dogwood. And then, as Megan described, we also have some plantings along a shelf in the silt pond itself with some native plants that would help maintain that silt pond with some beauty as well as with some function. So it is definitely our intention to maintain this property on a more regular basis than what has been done up until now. So we're told that the silt pond should be maintained at about a 5-foot depth. So we do plan to do an annual inspection that would be scheduled every summer. That's typically when it's a little bit more dry, so we would be able to see the interior of the pond. And we would then also have an opportunity to remove sediment or plant buildup that at that time. And if necessary, we would, we might have to excavate them, but it just depends on what we find during those annual inspections. So basically what you've heard from us is that we want to protect the watershed, the ultimate watershed, and we also want to preserve the functioning of this pond and its role in mitigating flood. This is what it was designed for, and it is not working in its current state. It's not functioning in that way. So with that ends our presentation. But as I said, we do have multiple sources here to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Ahern.
Thank you. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. Thank you, Ms. Rubino-Turco. So at this point, I'm just going to, if we could, gonna just adjust my screen so I can see everyone again. Thank you. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to questions from the commissioners. Anyone who has a question, please raise your hand, and I will eventually get to you. And okay, so we'll start with Mr. Prestige and then Ms. Gillette. Mr. Prestige, we do not have any audio from you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, Mr. Prestige.
Wonderful. Thanks. Commissioner Kevin Prestige. Questions through you, Mr. Chair. Two questions, and I suspect they will be from different speakers, but I'll read them both, I'll give them both up front. The first is, would someone please compare and contrast the wetlands functions and values now versus what the functions and values would be after the work has been done and the site has been allowed to reestablish? The second question is, with regards to the annual maintenance, makes a lot of sense. It's exactly what it was designed for. What would be the process for reviewing and approving that annual maintenance going forward? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I actually, this happened in the CIP meeting, and I think it's a good practice, is if you do have multiple questions, to get all of those questions out, and then they can be addressed rather than go back and forth. So that's good. Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Question goes to the applicant. Who wants to take it? Okay, Ms. Raymond. Chair recognizes Ms. Raymond. And just unmute your mic, please.
Ms. Raymond, you are muted.
Okay, great. Again, Megan Raymond, wetland scientist for the applicant. As it relates to the first part of your question and the functions and values, again, what we are looking at is these constructed, engineered wetland systems that are currently in a compromised state, even given the lack of maintenance since their creation in the early 80s. So what we do see is the functions and values for their intended use as for stormwater treatment are not functioning optimally now because there's no ability to renovate stormwater because of the lack of the volumetric capacity within the basin itself. So as it relates to the primary functions of these features, which is sediment and toxicant retention, nutrient removal, retention, and transformation, those functions are compromised. Also, flood flow, alteration, and attenuation. They're still present, but those primary functions for which these features were created, those functions would be enhanced with the routine maintenance of the removal of that accumulated silt within the confines of the 4,000 square foot silt pond, as well as the drainage ditch. And because, I think, as Ms. Vieira described so nicely, there is a synchronicity between these features, and because the pond is not able to hold, basically the tempo and the connection between them is off. And what we're seeing is an increase in flow-through drainage in the ditch as a result, and down-cutting and erosion around those banks and turbid water to ultimately Trout Brook without any attenuation. So you have the ability to address all of those concerns and those features just by initiating these maintenance routine as described. So the primary features as it relates to flood flow alteration, sediment and toxicant reduction, nutrient removal, transformation, and retention, those functions are present, but at a lower capacity than they would be following maintenance. And I guess as it relates to values, those are some more subjective criteria. But certainly, you could look to, I think presently when we wrote up the values as presented in these small systems, there's not an abundance, obviously, given the small size and landscape position, but the intention as it relates to the aesthetic value, that wasn't even mentioned as a value, but again, we're trying to address that component by not just restoring to a riprap edge, but by introducing some of these great native flora that allow for some aesthetics as well as some very localized habitat effects, but obviously primarily the bioassimilation capacity. And then as it relates to the maintenance, a lot of towns do it differently. So, but I think I'll defer to the chair to muse on the actual administration of maintenance of stormwater ponds. But I know that in a lot of areas that I work, that's considered an as of right feature. But again, that would be constructed, I believe, in this approval. You could potentially condition it for so many years. Or just kind of muse over how you'd like to see that work in the future. But again, these, in contrast to a lot of other stormwater wetlands that we see in the 80s, this area was all, according to the soil map, this area was filled and manipulated. It doesn't appear to the historical imagery that this silt pond was an excavated wetland system to begin with, but rather a feature primarily to address stormwater. Thank you. That concludes my answer, and I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Before we turn to Ms. Gillette's questions, I want to turn back to Mr. Prestage, and I just want to make sure that see if you have any follow-ups to the answer. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Rubino-Turco is raising her hand. So before we get back to you, Mr. Prestage, the chair recognizes the applicant. Rubino-Turco, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ahern. Through the chair, I just wanted to answer or try to answer a little bit about how we would do annual maintenance. And DPW, our Department of Public Works, does have extensive background in doing maintenance of waterways, watercourses, but we would conduct a visual inspection annually. We would measure the silt. John Phillips, Director of Public Works, and the engineering department certainly can lend vast experience, their knowledge of the Trout Brook Trail maintenance that's being done on the Trout Brook Trail that the town would be, that is also in charge of. There's other small water courses that Public Works maintains. So again, to Megan Raymond's response just a few minutes ago, this is something that they do on numerous locations around town. Thank you, Mr. Ahern.
Thank you, Mr. Rubino-Turco. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. So then I will, unless there's any further answer from the applicant, I will turn back to Mr. Prestage. Mr. Prestage, do you have any follow-up to the answer?
Commissioner Kevin Prestage, and through the chair, I do have one follow-up question. Certainly understand the maintenance process and the vast experience that the town has with moving water and dirt, no doubt. One question specifically for the maintenance. The project here is very carefully putting in some native vegetation and appears to be removing some invasive species, which is wonderful for even though small, for the very local habitat, wetland habitat there. Through the maintenance process, will the team, if I can just use that term, that is maintaining this silt pond be aware of those goals and the planting goals, such that when they do maintain the pond, they're sensitive to maybe that emergent vegetation and try to complement their activities to the goals by that vegetative planting? Thank you.
Thank you again. This is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Whoever on the applicant wants to take that question, please raise your hand. Oh, Mr. Dumais actually is going to hop in. Mr. Dumais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Todd Dumais, Town Planner. I did have a follow-up question to Commissioner Prestige for the applicant. At what point during your inspection process is it determined that what quantity of accumulated sediment will require additional removal? Has that been determined yet? So you inspect every year, you find X amount of accumulated sediment. At what point do we have to go back in and remove that sediment?
Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Who will be taking that question? Chair recognizes Ms. Raymond.
Thank you for the record, Megan Raymond, and Ms. Vieira can also speak to this, obviously. But I think that the intent was that the design depth, the original drawings for this was a 5 foot of water depth, and so that will be I think with the probing and the inspection. The goal is to maintain that 5 feet of depth. I mean, the intent of the emergent plantings is to allow, it's not going to be at a full encircle along the entire perimeter, but there'll be access points for maintenance. So we can the idea is you're going to put some effort and some money into establishing these emergent shelves. And so we certainly wouldn't want them to be, taken out with a swipe of a bucket, the first couple of years after getting them rooted and established. So knowing that it's always a sensitivity in terms of, getting the job done quickly and all these things, but I would think that there will be appropriate communications to ensure that the investment that the town is making in facilitating these features and functions of the pond will certainly be addressed and protected during the maintenance activities. That's the intention of the project.
Thank you, Ms. Raymond. Again, this is thank you, Ms. Raymond. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Do either Ms. Rubino-Turco or Ms. Yes, Ms. Vieira, please.
Okay. As Megan, Julie Vieira, Town of West Hartford. So as Megan had mentioned, yes, we establish a 5 foot depth to this, and it's actually, we're going to inspect it annually. I'm not really sure that we're going to have to do maintenance annually. It'll depend on how fast it would build up again, but keep in mind, we don't use sand anymore for treatments of snow removal. So I'm thinking a lot of this should not fill up as fast like in previous years. And as Megan had mentioned too, yeah, the plantings are not all around the pond, so there is access points to get in there to avoid the pond. And so, but pretty much we'd like to maintain that 5 foot water depth to prevent the buildup again and vegetation to start growing in there.
Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Thank you, Ms. Vieira. Anyone else from the applicant want to respond before I turn back to the commissioners? I see no hands. Okay, so Mr. Binkhorst, I'm going to put you in line after Ms. Gillette. I just want to go back to Mr. Prestige and or Mr. Dumais if you have any follow-up to the answer that you received. Start with Mr. Prestige. No, Mr. Prestige is indicating that he does not. Mr. Dumais, do you have any follow-up? Mr. Dumais is indicating that he does not. Okay, so then we will move on to Ms. Gillette and then Mr. Binkhorst. Ms. Gillette.
I have, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first, through you, Mr. Chairman, Liz Gillette, Commissioner. There's a I believe you may have talked about this. There's a storm drain in the baseball field that also leads into the silt pond, as well as the other inlets that come in. You talked about leveling and grading the storm drain on the other side of the driveway. How do you open up silted up pipes, and is that part of this project to make the baseball field drain usable and functional again, and any other that feed in? And I was curious about the communication that we got and wondered if we could have someone address the concerns of the resident. Thank you.
This is Kevin Ahern again. Thank you, Ms. Gillette. So there are two questions. I see Ms. Vieira is raising her hand. So Ms. Vieira, please take it away.
Hey, Julie Vieira, Town of West Hartford. So we had tried to video that pipe in the baseball field to the silt pond, but they were not able to get through it because it is filled with sediment. So as part of this, in Public Works has this feature to be able to jet that pipe. So we really can't jet that pipe until we can get the sediment out of the pond, and then we could jet the pipe. And it's probably going to be also the pipe from that control manhole to the pond, as well as that catch basin to the pond. So we do have a means of getting that clean, which we will. But we have to be able to access the other two ends of it, and right now we can only access one. And as far as that communication, when I read the question about the concern about to drain and dewater, so right now the silt pond is pretty much filled up with sediment, and so there is some water in there, but there's not a lot of water in there. So we don't anticipate having a lot of water to take out of there, but we would plan to, with a pump, a hose, and a filter bag on the end of it, take that water to the drainage ditch. Because as part of this project, Public Works will only be allowed to work on one project at a time. So if it's the silt, so they could work on the silt pond and still be able to utilize the drainage ditch in order to dewater it. So it's really not dredging of the pond, and certainly not the main pond. It's just a silt pond, and it's more of excavating out the accumulated sediment that's in it. We would try to blocked so that water, the only water that would get in it would be from overland runoff. So anything that came down the 48-inch pipe would just continue straight through into the drainage ditch. And maybe Justin could add to this, but I can't imagine it take them longer than a week or so.
Thank you, Ms. Vieira. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Does anyone on the applicant's team, does anyone else on the applicant's team want to chime in on that before I turn back to Ms. Gillette? Seeing none? Okay. So Ms. Gillette, do you have any follow-up to the answer to that question? Ms. Gillette is nodding her head no. So I will move on to the next commissioner's question. Mr. Binkhorst. Please unmute your mic, Mr. Binkhorst. Thank you.
So Commissioner Binkhorst, I really don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank the applicant for a very thorough presentation. The project seems very necessary for maintenance, and I think you did a very nice job. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Binkhorst. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, chair. Do we have any further questions from the panel? Raise your hand if you have any questions. Seeing none, does the applicant or the applicant's team have anything further? I'm just going to turn to Ms. Rubino-Turco to just sort of put that on the record.
Thank you. Thank you through the chair, Mr. Ahern. We rest our case, as it were. We thank you for your attention. We really want to get this pond cleaned up so that we can restore the baseball field, repair the fences that are popping out of the ground because of the flooding, and we think this will be an enhancement to that park. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rubino-Turco. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. All right, so at this point in the proceeding, we're going to turn to the public comment portion. We have already addressed the comment that came in prior here, and I want to ask the town planner, or excuse me, sorry, you ready? Do we have any callers at this point?
Mr. Chairman, we do not have any callers at this time.
All right. Thank you, Urida. Mr. Dumais, I'd like to ask you, Do we have any additional comments that came in via the email or mail, as it were?
Mr. Chairman, Todd DeMay for the record, we do not have any additional emailed comments since the hearing has begun.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. DeMay. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. So at this point, sorry, Ms. Maresca, did you raise your hand? Ms. Maresca did not raise her hand. Okay. So at this point, does the applicant have anything further before we close the hearing? I see that the applicant is nodding no. So at this point, the hearing is closed on this item. Now, as this is the only item on the public meeting agenda, we will immediately turn to deliberation on this item. And so this is an inland wetlands application. And so what we will do is we will follow our normal business. Mr. DeMay, though, I need to ask you who is seated on this item?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. DeMay, seated on this application will be Commissioner Binkhorst.
Thank you. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Thank you, Mr. DeMay. All right. And so we will turn to deliberation. So as we normally would do, I will entertain a motion so we can get the ball rolling. I see Mr. Prestige is indicating that he has a motion. Mr. Prestige.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige, through the chair, I would move that we approve this application. I would set 6 conditions. First would be plans of record be incorporated by reference in the permit as fully set forth and modified with the conditions below. 2, the wetland permit is subject to full compliance with the town erosion and sediment requirements and shall be installed and maintained in accordance with the 2002 Connecticut Guidelines for Soil Erosion and Sediment Control as amended. 3, weekly inspection reports of the sediment and erosion controls shall be submitted to the town planner. Additional erosion and sediment control measures shall be implemented and/or installed throughout the course of construction as if deemed necessary and directed by the design engineer and/or West Hartford town officials. 4, prior to the start of any site disturbance, all sediment and erosion controls and tree protection shall be installed. Once installed, but before the commencement of any disturbance, the town planner shall be notified and provided the opportunity to inspect. 5, the agency shall receive copies of all materials, correspondence, and permits received from Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. 6, and the final condition, the permit shall expire if not exercised within 5 years from the date of issuance or date of final resolution of any legal action challenging this permit. The permit shall not be assigned, transferred, sublet, or sold to any other person without written permission of the agency.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Just a point of order directed to the town planner, Mr. DeMay. I believe that there was discussion of an annual inspection. Is that simply included, or is that something that needs to be added as a condition by the movement?
Mr. Chairman, Todd DeMay, town planner for the record. There was discussion in the applicant's presentation. It was further discussed in some of the questions. However, it's always good practice if the commission is interested in seeing that be made part of any approval to set forth exactly what you're looking for in a condition. I think the applicant had agreed to during the hearing to submit or to conduct an annual inspection report. Your typical language would include something like they shall submit an annual inspection report back to the Inland Wetlands Agency. Based on the testimony I heard, I think it would then say something to the effect that that report shall detail the findings and provide written notice of the need of any additional sediment removal. I think that was the concern I heard from the agency. And then further, sediment removal as part of any maintenance activity shall not exceed a depth of 5 feet in the silt pond, since that was the design depth specified by Ms. Raymond and Vieira.
Okay, this is again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. So I direct back to Mr. Prestige. Mr. Prestige, do you accept that additional condition as part of your motion?
Commissioner Kevin Prestige, I accept that as condition number 7.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is the chairman, Mr. Ahern. All right, so at this point, then we will move on to deliberation. Any members wishing to speak, please raise your hand and you will be recognized. Chair recognizes Mr. Prestige.
Sure. Commissioner Kevin Prestige, I'd like to, before the rest of the deliberations or the rest of the comments come in, make a number of observations. I think this is as well engineered and designed application for the really rehabilitation of a silt or sediment control pond as we've seen. We think that it touches on not only contributing to the overall not just the local, but the water quality in the area. They've addressed that, but they've also addressed locally things such as making sure that the wetland is left better off after this work than it is currently through selectively removing certain vegetation, putting back in natural vegetation. I think it makes a lot of sense. Fundamentally, this is a silt pond that worked. It collected silt, and now it needs to be cleaned out. It had not been cleaned out in a long time. Again, a very careful plan has been put forward to do the work now and to also maintain going forward. I'd also like to observe the very careful thought of the engineering department to say, and you don't get this from a lot of people, I don't know how often we're going to have to go in here and clean this out. What we will do is observe, assess, and then make a plan going forward. That's proper, that's careful, and I think that's a really healthy way to go about this. So knowing that they don't know when it's going to fill up, at what rate, and how much they're going to remove right away, that makes sense. I do think that it's going to be interesting that there be a careful balance of, you don't necessarily want to go in there every year to remove a half inch of sediment. Why do all that disturbance? But at the same time, they will need to go in there, and they'll learn as they go. I also want to put another couple of things on there. It doesn't appear as though there's going to be any permanent loss of any wetlands and functions and values. Quite the opposite. Put on the record is that there'll be a replacement of what was there a long time ago, and it'll be enhanced. And then the last thing is, although there will be a few trees that are going to be cut down, they're going to put them back elsewhere in the park, allowing for that kind of net number of trees to remain in the park, yet not put them in a place that they might have to get cut down in the future for other maintenance activities. Again, very carefully thought, well designed, and certainly in support.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Did I just see Ms. Gillette? Chair recognizes Ms. Gillette.
I was going to overlook the tree issue, but yes, they will be put back in other places, but not at the same circumference. Beyond that, though, I'm very glad to see this project, and I hope we can do more things where the opportunities lie in West Hartford. As Mr. Prestige said, it's a silt pond that worked, and it did. It silted up. I'm glad, because that's a lot of street runoff that doesn't make it into Trout Brook. We have a lot of pipes and inlets and little creeks and things that hit Trout Brook, and I wish they all had the opportunity to run through a silt pond or something similar to enhance the quality and to protect the quality of Trout Brook, and so I'm very pleased to see this, and I think it's a very good thing. And that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Gillette. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I am looking to see if any other members wish to comment on this during deliberation before we take a vote. I see no further comments on this. Then let me try your minds. We will be taking, then we will be voting, and we will be taking that vote by roll call. Mr. Dumais, please proceed.
Commissioner Binkhorst.
Mr. Binkhorst, please unmute your microphone.
Aye. Sorry.
Commissioner Gillette.
Aye.
Commissioner Maresca.
Aye.
Commissioner Prestige.
Aye.
And Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Aye.
With that, Mr. Chairman, the Wetlands Agency finds that this permit is granted in compliance with sections 10.2 and 10.4 of your wetland regulations and is unanimously approved.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. I want to thank all of the members of the applicant team who participated in this. This was our first public hearing, so we're still working out the kinks here. So thank you very much to everyone who was involved. So at this point, we're going to move on to item number 5. Mr. Dumais.
Thank you. Good night.
Item number 5, the Tropic Trail Maintenance Agreement, a resolution authorizing the execution of the permanent maintenance easement in agreement with the state of Connecticut to support the construction of the Tropic Trail. So what you have in your agenda packets is a resolution, a maintenance agreement, and then there was a series of Tropic Trail phase plans that identified trail easement areas. There was an error on my part for not transmitting an additional set of plans that was put on the website late in the process, but there was another set of plans that I'll touch upon in a minute. The first portion of the maintenance agreements and easements are for the state-owned land for the town to continue with construction of phases 5 and 6 of the Troutbrook Trail. They're largely built on town-owned land, but there are portions that will need to be constructed on state-owned land. There are 4 parcels that are called state-owned parcels. Those are referenced on the maps that you received in your mailings, and they're online. And they have a number of different reference numbers that don't necessarily match to the address points, but they're the same locations. We have a quirk in our GIS system whereby the addresses that have been historically assigned to a number of the state-owned land along Troutbrook Drive don't actually match with some of the real land records. The second part of this is a permanent and non-exclusive easement in favor of the town over the state of Connecticut to facilitate. I'm sorry, we already covered that part. The second half is for the maintenance of the flood control areas and the distance of the water course from New Park Avenue north to Asylum Avenue. So those are the flood control areas. If you remember a few years ago, the state of Connecticut conducted a significant amount of flood control maintenance work that largely consisted of vegetation and removal, principally large woody growth. Because this portion of the Troutbrook is a channelized stream course and it's designed for flood flow mitigation purposes, it was not supposed to have vegetation, particularly woody vegetation, grow up within its within the floodway. So there was a significant vegetation removal. So this portion of the agreement would transfer some of that responsibility back onto the town, which is documented in both the resolution and the easements. And I would note for the record, much of that work is currently and has historically been conducted by our Public Works Department. With us tonight to answer any further questions, we have Gina Verano, the Deputy Corporation Counsel. I got her title wrong. I was working off an older roll call when I called the roll prior to her promotion. Congratulations, Gina. And we have our Town Engineer, Dwayne Martin. And I think we also have John Phillips, Public Works Director. He's on a call-in line. So the three of them are here to answer any detailed questions you might have on this referral. That's my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Do any of the members have questions for the town on this? Please raise your hand if you do. I see no hands. Just checking. Okay. Mr. Dumais, do you have anything further? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Prestige. Mr. Prestige has a question.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige. Mr. Chairman, I was late with the raising of my hand. You didn't miss it. And then through you, question to, I believe, to Mr. Dumais. So before us right now is the recommended approval of the easement. My understanding is that what is not before us necessarily is a plan for what to do on the easement. Of course, where the easement is and the mapped out trail will drive a lot of future activities and limit what can be done. But that said, just to be clear, we're talking about just the easement right here. That's a question.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dumais, through you to Commissioner Prestige, it's the easement and maintenance agreements. I will actually refer to Mr. Martin, town engineer, but I believe one, if not both phases of the Trout Brook phases 5 and 6 have already received approval from the Wetlands Agency for that work, since it's within a upland review area. So the agency, past agencies, and those permits are still valid, have reviewed the detailed work. It hasn't changed with respect to the layout of the trail. That trail falls within the areas identified in the easement documents. You can see it actually on the plan. So there's no change there. This is just really catching everything up in terms of the documentation with the state of Connecticut that we had hoped, the town had hoped to have in place back when these trails initially received a grant funding and then also local wetland approval. It's taken the town and the state some time to reach agreement on these documents, and that's where we are in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Mr. Dumais, you referred to Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, do you have anything further to add?
Dwayne Martin, town engineer. Just to confirm what Todd said, yes, both phase 5 and 6 of the Trout Brook Trail was previously approved. I want to say it's probably 2 years ago by the Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Agency. And so the design is done. The location of the trails were set as part of the design process and the permitting. And so the easement is just following, and the maintenance agreement is just following that process.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. Mr. Dumais, do you have anything further?
I do not.
Okay. Turning it back to the commission, do any of the commissioners have any other questions for the applicant? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, I see no further questions. So then at this point, then I will entertain a motion for purposes of discussion on this item. The nature of the motion would be to recommend approval. Do we have a motion on this item? I see Mr. Prestige's hand. Mr. Prestige.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige, I would motion that we recommend approval of the agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair. We do not require a second on this item, so the motion is active. Any discussion on the motion? Raise your hand if you have anything to say. Okay, and actually, I'm sorry, Mr. Dumais, I do need to ask you who is voting on this item.
Mr. Chairman, Todd Dumais, for the record, seated on this item will be Commissioner Gomes.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Chairman Kevin Ahern. Seated on this item is Ms. Gomes. Unless we have anything further, let me try your minds. Mr. Dumais, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Gomes.
Aye.
Commissioner Gillette.
Aye.
Commissioner Maresca.
Aye.
Commissioner Prestige,
Aye.
Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Aye.
And with that, that's a unanimous recommendation to the town council.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Again, this is Kevin Ahern. The item has passed 5-0. So we will move on to item number 6, the town planner's report. Mr. Dumais, do you have anything to report?
I do not have anything to report other than to note the commission of our next special meeting, which is on a Wednesday, May 13th. And that's at 7 p.m. That's 6:30 time on your agenda is purely for logging in and calling to ensure we get the WebEx access set up.
Okay, this is Kevin Ahern, the chair again. Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Moving on, item number 7, do we have any additional information items?
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Dumais. We do not.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. All right, well, with that then, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this first virtual public hearing of the commission. Entertain a motion. Mr. Prestige.
Commissioner Kevin Prestige. So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Prestige. Again, this is Kevin Ahern. We will take a roll call on the adjournment motion. Mr. Dumais.
Commissioner Binkhurst.
Aye.
Commissioner Gillette.
Aye.
Commissioner Maresca.
Sorry. Aye.
Commissioner Prestige.
Aye.
Chairman Ahern.
Aye.
With that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais.